I'm going to start, and we'll see. Okay. I believe I have started the event. Well. Yes.
I'll share the screen or start or
no. Let me first start officially. Okay. Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I believe it is one of the major impacts of the pandemic that world has somehow become smaller these last couple of months. We have been traveling from one place to the other through all these webinars. We are meeting with different people, and this is probably one of the positive sides of the pandemic, to be on the optimistic side. I would like to welcome you all to the second public space talk series of Eastern Mediterranean University Urban Research and Development Center. For your information, this webinar will be recorded for future use and will be accessible on the website of EMU in a couple of days' time. For the ones who may not know, I would like to give brief information about our center. EMU Urban Research and Development Center, since it was established in 1999, aims to deliver innovative responses to urban challenges by providing a forum of contributions to the quality of urban environment in order to promote sustainable urban settlements and livable urban settlements. Committed to serving Cyprus, obviously, our center follows its mission by stimulating some research into urban and regional issues and contributing to the knowledge in the field of urban planning and urban design for and on behalf of other parties within Cypriot settlements. And following its mission, our center is organizing COVID-19 public space talk series to provide virtual discussion platform to share know-how on the future of our cities and public places. So when the concepts such as urban health, inhabitant health, resilient cities, etc., have become more prominent due to the pandemic, we believe that we have to revisit the future of our cities and living environments, and more importantly, we have to do it in a different way than before. With this in mind, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Ashraf Salama as our second speaker through our public space talk events. Professor Ashraf Salama is a professor of architecture, and he is currently director of the research cluster in architecture and urbanism in the Global South. He was the director of research and consulting at Adams Group Architects, Charlotte, North Carolina, and has led 3 schools of architecture over the past 25 years in Egypt, Qatar, and the United Kingdom. He has authored and co-edited 12 books and published over 170 articles and chapters in international referee press. And Professor Salama is the chief editor of ArchNet IJAR and the co-chief editor of Open House International. Professor Salama is the recipient of the 2017 UIA Can Şumi Prize for Excellence in the Architectural Education and Criticism. On behalf of Eastern Mediterranean University and our center, I would like to thank Professor Salama once more to have accepted our invitation. And I would be leaving the screen to him so that he can give up his speech. Over you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just start by sharing the screen. But before I start, I just want to welcome everyone and thank you very much for your attendance. And also, I have to thank Professor Şebnem Hushkara for inviting me to give this talk and share with you some of the ideas I've been developing over the past few years. So I'll share my screen now, and then we will start, and then at the end there will be questions and answers, and I'm happy to respond to your questions. So let me see here. Do you see my screen?
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Okay. It should show actually.
Well, I see it in the content. Maybe I should be doing that. Yeah, I think it's there.
It's there. Okay.
Let's see. Right. Yes, it is there.
Very good. So I will start by, as I said, thanking everyone for coming, and thanks Professor Shadman for the opportunity. The topic is not really rocket science. It's talking about social issues and spatial issues and how they relate. The term social spatial has acquired really importance over the past 10 years, maybe, and people used to express it differently. So if we look, for example, at how people were looking at it, it used to be portrayed as human ecology. And I'll get to that in a minute. But before that, I just want to show you that to follow a simple sequence of the presentation, I have developed it in these components, which is basically unpacking some of the key concepts, very, very brief, and then asking 3 questions: why, what, and how. I'll try to react to why and what in an elaborate manner, and then how will be briefly, because it's about really research and tools and things like that. And then I'll focus later on the COVID-19 implications. So these are the 3 concepts of it. In order to unpack the idea of the spatiality of the social, it is basically, in essence, an expression of the social spatial. And the social spatial, until the 60s, was defined by geographers, environmental psychologists, sociologists as human ecology. And the term itself was accused of being too biased to anthropology and animal anthropology. And from then, the idea of social spatial emerged, and the work of the environment behavior movement, environmental psychology movement, as well as the key works of Henry Lefebvre. The social spatial perspective in urbanism or in urban studies deal with the idea of how people as individuals and in groups engage with the built infrastructure, whether cities, spaces, buildings, at all levels and at all scales. And it's assuming that the social space functions or operates as a product of human actions and behaviors and activities, and at the same time, as a result of human actions, and human actions are influenced by it. So it's a reciprocal relationship. Within the social spatial perspectives, built environments are in essence and intrinsically meaningful. Why? Because they communicate messages. So the idea of messages and semiology and what do we understand, for example, from the image that we see right now, it tells us a lot about the culture and about people and about behavior and about how people engage with the environment, and all these elements. It tells us also about culture, politics, society, and the larger issues. But speaking of that, or speaking of the socio-spatial, we cannot talk about it in isolation of two important terms, because many people confuse these issues. One is the cultural dimension, and the other is the behavioral dimension. So when we say social here, we need to refer to these two terms. Okay, so the cultural defines what the social is, what is acceptable within a group of people, within the larger society. And the behavioral is the result of practicing what is acceptable. So it's cultural first, and then the social is in between, and that social is translated into activities, actions, behaviors, and so on. So that's an important differentiation. In many disciplines, people refer to these as environmental psychology, as I said, or environment behavior studies, depending on the disciplinary orientation. But as I say, the term social-spatial acquired really recent importance because it's understood by urban geographers, human geographers, planners, architects. Other terms might not be as understood as, or as easy to understand as social-spatial. So it's really important to try to see how the social manifests at different scales and at different environment, and historically and recently in different types of environments. So this is not really a main lecture about what is exactly social-spatial, but it tries to touch on key issues related to how we translate our understanding of the environment based on our understanding of social norms, cultural values, and all these aspects. But in all cases, all human artifacts, buildings, built environments, urban environments, are developed in the sense that they embody human choices and human decisions. So most cultures have been developed based on these decisions. And it results in urban environments, or environments like what you see in the slide, that reflects spiritual, cultural, human, and functional values simultaneously. But the translation of this understanding is evident when we look at, okay, this is a spatial environment, two conservative contexts, and probably same cultural values, but they are manifesting in two different ways. So the one to the left, the image to the left, you would see Fas, Morocco, where the social context determined the entire structure of the city. While to the right is Shibam, again, the social context determined how the city will look like, the relationship to the larger environment, building heights, neighboring values, and all these elements. So to try to respond to the question of why and specialize social issues, we want to try to answer the question of why here. And the question of why becomes evident when we look at the current transformations and the current problems that we see today. Because when we say social or socio-spatial, we don't mean that we're studying human interaction with the environment in isolation from the larger problem. So we have to really understand the larger problem to be able to understand the socio-spatial. So in trying to address the question of why, one would need to look at these transformations. We see now, for example, transformations in the structure of contemporary societies. Okay, rising needs for diversity, rising needs for women, emerging needs for children and those with special population, deterioration of the built heritage, crisis in squatter settlements, which is a growing phenomenon. We see also building types that we have not seen before historically, and all these complexities require understanding of how people engage with these environments. There is a surge in the construction of sustainable environments and the associated restrictions of design and assessment of sustainable environments, in most cases from an environmental perspective, oversimplifying the social and human perspective or dimension. We see also transformations in many cities in the Middle East and Southeast Asia in terms of the dominance of the global condition and how this global condition is leading to the loss of identity of many cities or settlements and communities, and the loss of urban identity. We see also problems associated, spatial problems that have no doubt social implications. Spatial problems at a larger scale, wars, civic conflict, disasters are all problems, and we can see here in the image to the left of the screen natural disasters and how natural disasters lead to displacement of communities. So displacement of communities is a social dimension, but the disaster itself and the spatial implications are spatial. We see also that discourse that dominates the academic scene or the academic settings about, okay, environment versus development, nature versus culture, and the juxtaposition of these. We see also rising needs in post-industrial societies that have their own problems, and many cities in Europe, for example, are post-industrial. They were relying heavily on industries, and industries were exported to China, and now societies are struggling even to define themselves and the economic base, and that economic base translates into social actions and behaviors within the city. In other contexts, we see rising needs of migrant communities, issues related to equalities, issues related to urban sprawl that characterize most of the cities in the global south and in some cases in the global north. We see these contrasting realities, which are really striking, and how income inequalities manifest. Income inequality is a social issue, and how that is manifesting in the physical environment, in the spatial issue, or in the spatial environment is an important dimension too. So all of these problems and all of these issues or spatial problems have social implications. But now the question is, what do they tell us? So we have a number of problems and a number of special conditions. Some of them are historical problems, some of them are emerging problems, and they tell us that demands for multiple types of knowledge are clearly on the rise. So we need to continuously acquire knowledge to be able to solve these areas or these challenges and address them, whether in our actions in terms of education and our actions in terms of research, or provide policy recommendations on how this can enable solutions to various governments and authorities and all that. So when you look at this list of knowledge types, of course, all of them have spatial dimension and all of them have social dimensions. So here we're trying to look at these problems from the two perspectives. If you look at this diagram, it lists, I don't want to go through them one by one, but it lists the types of knowledge that are required to solve these issues. Now, when we look at this, we start to say, are these the only types? No, the diagram is not exclusive. We can keep adding different types as we go, and all of them have spatial implications, and all of them have social implications. So that's an important dimension we need to look at. Another thing, which is, I have to say that I put this slide last minute before I finished the presentation, because I felt it's really important to underscore the idea of the social. When we look at these four components: technology, climate, culture, aspirations, these four components are important, and they determine transformations, and they determine some problematic areas if exist in the built environment. And any change in them change the overall production of the environment. But they don't change that rapidly. Even climate change, when we talk about it now, it doesn't change on a daily basis. And its change on a daily basis doesn't impact individuals directly on a daily basis. But the idea of culture, for example, we always say, okay, we are witnessing cultural change. Yes, we are. But culture doesn't change every day. Culture changes every few decades. Okay, there are smaller elements that within the culture that give or can be treated as indicators for a change, but these don't mean cultural change. Cultural change doesn't happen every day. Technological change doesn't happen every day. But what happens almost every day is cultural or social aspirations. Everyone aspires to be different, to be better, whether at a group level or at an individual level. So the idea of social aspirations is basically behind the transformations and the problems and the good things also that we see in the environment, the positive aspects of the environment, behind the relationship between the social and the spatial. So social aspirations are important and a key parameter in understanding the relationship between the social and the spatial. As part of my own research and writing, I've tried to address some of these issues in different settings and in different contexts and through different channels, whether in books, book chapters, journal papers, guest editorials, and all these publication or dissemination routes. But the whole purpose is to try to understand the notion of place. And place can be looked at from, of course, our theme is simply the social and the spatial. So can be looked at from these disciplinary perspectives. So looking at place, for example, for architects and urban designers, they design environments that accommodate people's needs, wants, values, preferences, and all these. Geographers study places, study human movements, they study mobility, they study engagements of societies, and all these. Environmental psychologists do something else with place. Tourists as users and tourism studies also examine places. Developers promote places. Planners and urban designers. So place can be looked at even from further disciplines. So here I'm identifying a number of disciplines, but we can look at it from even more perspectives and more disciplinary perspectives. Within that, there is a number of theories and a number of approaches that evolved over the past 30, 40 years. And I'm going to refer to some of them because they respond to the notion of how do we, or what do we study when we try to look at the relationship between the social and the spatial. So if we look, for example, at David Cantor, a classical writing in the 70s, talking about the constituents of place and how place is influenced by three key components of psychological conceptions: actions and behaviors and physical attributes. Normally, the interaction of psychological conceptions and physical attributes, which is basically urban form, are translated into actions and behaviors. This was a pioneering model in the 70s because nobody was speaking this language in the 70s. Everybody was occupied by postmodernism and eventually, late modern. And so all these elements within architecture were not mainstream. Now they are becoming more mainstream over the past 10 years or so. When we look at other scholars like Ken Dovey, also introduced two notions which are really important about how do we understand place and place, seeing place as a framework that accommodates people, ideas, human evolution, human actions, meanings, and it allows this to prosper as it grows. But he also introduced the notion of becoming places, which is really very interesting. The idea of being and becoming becomes so important here because, as we say, cultural aspirations or social aspirations keep changing. So the place also keeps changing based on these changes. So the idea being something now means that it's going to become something else in the future, and that future is soon, as in few months, for example. So framing places, becoming places are also important concepts to materialize our understanding of the spatial and the social. We can see many people following David Cantor try to conceive place in different ways using different terminologies and different parameters depending on the area of focus or the cases they were investigating. But for example, here Punter, Jonathan Punter in early 90s, 91, was focusing on form image activity, which is basically physical attributes mean form, image means psychological conceptions, because here image is looked at as part of cognition and as part of perception. And then activity, which is actions and behaviors. Other scholars, for example, like John Montgomery, said the same thing: physical setting, meaning, and activity. So there is an overall agreement among scholars and theorists that a place has three components and all relate to the social and the spatial. So, of course, there are underlying parameters for each, spatial and social, and that depends on the characteristics of place one is trying to investigate. But overall, there is a general agreement within these theories about the constituents of place in terms of what is physical, and then how do we think about it, and then how to behave as a reaction or as a result of this thinking. But more comprehensively, this is really an important framework which is based on social sciences, and it's coming from Henry Lefebvre. Of course, he didn't say it exactly this way, but we were trying in our research and our own research to develop a framework that fits into a number of contexts, and it's like a plug-in framework where we can remove certain elements of it or add more elements depending on the context one is investigating. But we look at space in these terms: conceived, perceived, and lived. So what is different here is that the idea of who makes decisions is added to this framework. The previous frameworks were focusing on the social and the spatial only. So that framework, as you see now, is focusing on the conceived, which is basically who's making decisions about that, because also those who make decisions are part of the value system, whether they are architects or government people or authorities or whoever, they are part of the value system. So conceived space is a space which is conceptualized by decision makers and specialized people. Perceived space is the space that translates relationship within the larger society. Big players, real estate companies, and how they make decisions about locations, for example, of new developments, or even large scale companies when they decide to have their headquarters in certain parts of the cities and smaller satellite offices in other parts of the cities. How these networks develop represent the spatial practice at a large scale. And then the lived space, which is the space that impact you and me, which relates to individual attachments, individual interpretations and subjective attachments to places, and how do we associate with them. We tried to use this and detail the framework in a very, very thorough interpretation, looking at urban governance, spatial practice, and identification. The identification and spatial practice is basically the social and the spatial, and governance is about making decisions. And all are based on three assumptions: that urban space is a product of decision making within the public sector in most cases. Urban space is a product of collective spatial practice, and urban space is a product of subjective attachment. So the relationships between these are really very critical and very important. And the more the relationship is fruitful and engaging and interacting, people are happier with urban environments and spaces are run effectively and smoothly. You don't see crime rates, you don't see vandalism, you don't see all of these negative behaviors that sometimes dominate certain contexts. But one important thing I want to say here, the three spaces are not stagnant. They evolve. So if you change how decisions are made in a local authority, for example, that has implications on the perceived space and how networks will develop. And it has implications on the lived space and how people will associate with their environments and attach to it. So the three components of space and the relationships between them can exist in a given time frame. So we can study a city, for example, over the past 5 years and fix the period and look at the city within those 5 years without any change. And then we can start to look at the city using the same framework to see how these types of spaces, the conceived, perceived, lived, have evolved over different periods and different historical periods within the city. So that framework is really very useful to look at a city within a given time frame and how it evolves. One important aspect also is that maybe this is not the subject of this lecture, but we were trying to look at, in addressing the relationship between the social and the spatial, trying to look at how housing production is understood by people and how housing production is governed and determined. So trying to look at integrationist perspectives and looking at, for example, 3 different theories coming from 3 different disciplines and how they help us understand the relationship between people and the housing production and housing typologies and housing choices. So the three theories are based on the work, for example, of Pierre Bourdieu on the notion of habitus and how that translates into needs, status, and habits and actions. The work of another anthropologist called Mary Douglas talk about the group grid structure and talks about a very interesting phenomenon, which is the issue of hierarchical communities and how people are part of the overall larger society, and some people are not part of it or prefer not to be part of it, and how that translates into attitudes, and how these attitudes, we took that thinking, how these attitudes could reflect on housing transformations and housing choices. This is an important relation between the social and the spatial. Another theory of Tom Høyrup, who's ethnographer, Danish, and he is talking about the idea of life modes, but not based on social attitudes or individual status or social status. No, it's based on work modes. So a wage earner, for example, or a career-oriented person would have different understanding of home environments. And as we see now, for talking about COVID-19 implications, as we see now, we can find easily that the idea of home is changing. How do we understand the home? For some people, home was a place for entertainment, playing with the kids at home and watching TV and all that. Now, the home is becoming a workplace. So how all these dynamics integrate and understood is really important. The idea of life moods. Definitely a wage earner is different from a career-oriented person, is different from a businessman, different from, and how they treat the house and how they treat the home environment and understand the home environment. So that's about what? The theories behind understanding the social and the spatial. So moving into how is also important. Of course, we can talk about how forever, for long, because it addresses knowledge acquisition. Basically, how do we gather information about people as they relate to the environment would be an important response to the question. So what kind of tools we use, what kind of parameters we identify when looking at environments like the one we see here. So the answering the question itself is really a subject also of a different lecture, but it's really very important to highlight few points here about the how. One point, looking at the previous problems that were presented in the first few slides, and then the complexity of the types of knowledge, they tell us two important things. All the problems that we see and the urban condition and the future of it. One, the urban condition is hybrid. The future of it is not predictable, is uncertain. We don't know. You can have a strategic plan, you can have master planning, all that is fine. But you do a master plan today and circumstances, economic circumstances, for example, change 6 months later, then the entire master plan is obsolete. So the idea of strategic thinking and hybrid modes of thinking is really very important in that context. I want to say something here related to types of research. Most research now in social sciences and humanities in the UK is not about going through the book and identifying a tool to bring information and analyze the information and present the information and that's it. No, it's about engagement. So it's about knowledge dissemination, it's about knowledge interaction, and it's about knowledge transfer. How this can function within an enlightened society. So now, looking at the social spatial dimension within an uncertain hybrid condition requires hybrid modes of thinking. So if it's a hybrid condition consisting from many facets, then hybrid modes of thinking should be the norm. Now, within the hybrid modes of thinking, those who are interested in the social aspects and how they relate to spatial dimensions of the environment are typically classified within two frames of reference. One is called anti-positivist, which is basically structuralist, and one is emancipationist, those who do participatory design, community planning, and all that. So if you look at this diagram, it talks about the systems of inquiry. And my comment on that diagram, this was part of an article I've written last year, trying to conceptualize research as it relates to architecture and urbanism, all kinds of research. But here, when you look at the diagram, the socio-spatial dimension are part of the position of anti-positivism and emancipationism, which means what? It relates to two theories of knowledge, ontology and epistemology, and I'm not going to make it a philosophical presentation. But when we look at ontology and epistemology, ontology is basically about the nature of things. So examining the nature of being, examining the nature of and knowledge about an object or an environment. Epistemology is simple, how this knowledge is communicated, is conveyed. That's it. So these are two philosophical positions that dominate research and knowledge acquisition thinking. Most of the social spatial research falls within the anti-positivist research or frame of reference. If we look at it, in terms of ontology, it believes that there are multiple realities. So any reality, any building that we see is not one reality, because it can be subjected to different modes of interpretations depending on who's looking at it. Unlike the international styles and modernism, where everything was the same. So the people were assumed to be part of the objective reality, not subjective reality. In terms of epistemology, the anti-positivist knowledge is subjective, and discovery of new values, preferences, and all these aspects are really important and part of that. So most of the social spatial research and interest within urban settings or within architecture or within even interior spaces or even ergonomics relate to that anti-positivist position. Maybe emancipationist goes beyond research and trying to intervene in the reality, which is basically about how to transform research into actions, how to try to change realities for the better. The positivists accept reality as is. So, and reality is based on science and is based on facts, and is not subjected to multiple interpretations, which goes entirely against the social dimension of the built environment. We already know that there are many tools, and they are stemming from social science research in most cases, whether we are doing questionnaires or interviews or observation studies or mapping, or all these are important. But now, will they remain valid? This is an important question. If the lockdown measures continue, maybe it's not happening where you are in your context, but it could eventually happen. You never know. In the context of many cities now, people are debating the reliability of these tools. and whether these tools will continue with us. This is an important question that we really need to respond. And I think the professional academic community need to react to how can we develop new methods based on less physical interaction, online interaction. How can you do a proper interview online? How can you do a proper interview, questionnaire online? How can you have focused discussions and group discussions online? All these elements will definitely, and the current condition will definitely alter the typical tool we used to do. So we used to do these kind of diagrams, these kind of mapping techniques, tables, all kinds of questionnaire sheets and nice analysis and nice diagrams. But the future, I would expect, is not going to be this. And I think there will be a need to other forms of research. We have colleagues in our universities trying to look at the reliability and validity of these tools to continue, and also the reliability of new tools that range from, say, photo interviewing, diaries, journaling, asking people to write stories and taking these stories to analyze them online. Online interviews, as I mentioned, reenactment videos and how to interpret videos. People record themselves, give you permission to look at these, and you start to analyze that. Auto photography, basically giving people cameras, sending them cameras to start to photograph the environment to express their needs, wants, and values. All these aspects, I would expect, of course, it's in experimentation now. All these aspects are really critical now. And I would expect that the current tools will eventually be replaced by emerging tools in social sciences. Now, since we are speaking of the pandemic, which has generated a very strange condition and a dramatic, I would say, a dramatic health crisis in the first place, which altered or generated a number of limitations, restrictions, lockdowns, and all these. And also it altered dramatically how cities look like. It's really, this is part of New York. When you look at this, New York was never like that during the day, never. So now we can talk about some spatial implications also that relate to COVID-19, which is the subject of the hour. About maybe when the whole thing started in March, I was really, in the beginning, at a personal level, I was distressed and I felt life is put on hold. And what we're going to do about this? And I had many travels and I was supposed to go here and there and all that. And then I said, okay, let's take advantage of the time and do something positive. And it ended up with, I think, a comprehensive conceptualization of how different disciplines can contribute to the pandemic and the COVID-19 coronavirus spread, but also focusing on architecture and how this could change architecture and urbanism, and also possible areas of research in the future that we can look at. So this is a classification about urbanism post-pandemic, during pandemic, and during the spread. And if you look at it, trying to look at it from different disciplinary perspectives. So you have urban dynamics as a key component, urban factors, factors that generate the urban environment and impact the urban environment, distancing measures, and living and working patterns. Of course, all these diagrams are to externalize ideas, so they are not exclusive. You can draw a diagram next to it and add another circle and add another dimension, okay? But the whole idea here is trying to show that different disciplines can work together to understand a phenomenon. architects and urban designers will not be able to do it on their own and alone. They have to work with other people. Otherwise, they will remain in isolation, really. So if an architect cannot speak the language of environmental psychology and cannot speak the language of whatever, geography or other elements, it's really very important to integrate these and be able to sit with people from other disciplines. One important thing, when we sit with people from other disciplines, we start saying, no, this is not how we do things. We do things differently. Once you say that, you establish boundaries with other people. So it's really very important to try to integrate and try to work with other people. So when we look at this, I'll pick on some of these elements because it was a different lecture, but here in this diagram, it generated that paper about coronavirus questions that will not go away, and trying to conceptualize the whole thing. That article generated an interview, which is really interesting. And in that interview, I was asked this question about density. And I had to think about it really carefully, because we learned that density is really very important. It brings economic benefits, it brings diversity, it brings a lot of good things. And now density is blamed, that it's a bad thing. It's creating problem, and it's virus spread, and in dense areas, they couldn't control the spread of the virus and all these aspects. So when you ask this question, is this pandemic making density deadly, obsolete, gone? Or is it too simplistic? And that, in a way, was my response. Basically, when you look at how studies explore the idea of density, a very recent study in 2019 was looking at the contribution of density to cities. And they looked at, it was a meta-analysis, high-level analysis, looking at 180 cities. And the simple response was urban density has very high positive effects on economies. So you cannot compromise economy. So in order to be able to speak the language of economy and the social spatial language, then we need to compromise. We cannot look at density as a bad thing or as an absolute good thing. We need a balance. We learned throughout the history that density is important. It characterized traditional environments. We looked at it in positive terms. We tried to simulate it in new urban interventions and in new projects and new conceptual analysis about cities and in the future of cities. So density, in my view, will remain important. And we can look at other views and how or what's happening and why other views are adopting their position. Some people are arguing, no, density is going to create really big problems. Trying to compare how SARS was spread in China 15 years ago in 2003 and how coronavirus was spread recently. So they say that, okay, SARS was spread over a period of 8 months. It killed 5,000 people in 8 months. Okay, while in 7 weeks, it killed 4,000 people. So you can look at these differences, and in the past, Chinese cities were not as dense as they are now. So they blame it on density, but they forget one important thing, that coronavirus as a disease or as a virus is contagious, is different from SARS. SARS did not go beyond Southeast Asia, maybe in few countries around the world, but that one is spread and is contagious and is really dangerous in terms of spread. So it's not about density here, which supports the second view. And the second view says, okay, no, density will remain important. Not necessarily the example of Hong Kong is we need to adopt. We're not saying this, but they just trying to go for the extreme image of density. They argue that Hong Kong and Singapore are denser than London and New York, but they managed to control the spread of the disease. London and New York couldn't, okay, but more dense cities managed to do it. So it's through taking restrictive measures that are not architectural or planning or physical, basically tracing, detection, isolation, and all these aspects. So many people are saying density is not necessarily a public health problem. The virus is a public health problem. Density is an architectural and urban problem and is not impacting the public health problem. This is the other view. So now I would say that the future planning of cities will have to balance it. Because also you can say there is a very good argument that you can control density, you can control disease spread in high density by restricting movement on infected areas. So if you have an infected area that is very high in density in terms of population and the urban mass, then you can control it, and that's it. You solve the problem. So high density can be seen as important to control the spread of a disease. But in many respects, balancing the idea of clustering, compartmentalization, compactness, all these aspects need to work together in the future. So it will be about management of cities.
It's 4 o'clock.
And management of people. It happened here that the computer is telling me it's 4 o'clock, but I'll try to move on. So now the other question is about, as part of understanding the social spatial, is, okay, what's going to happen from these distancing measures? How they are impacting people. I live in the city center of Glasgow, and if you look at the city in mainstream times, it's a very active city, very happy city, lots of activities and lots of nightlife, morning life, everything you can see in the city center of Glasgow, and as well as Edinburgh, 45 minutes away and all that. Now, the city center is deserted. There's nothing in it. Okay, we believe that things will not stay the same and we are in a transition period. But that transition period will remain in our psyche. We will not forget it. Definitely, we will not forget this. And if this happens collectively, it will impact our behaviors and actions in the future. It's like when someone has an accident in a specific street. In the future, they avoid going to that street. It remains in the psyche. So when this remains in our collective thinking and collective memory, definitely it will impact our actions and behaviors. So I look here at two concepts, a number of concepts actually, home zone and home range. Home zone is basically the immediate environment around people's houses. Home range is the larger environment. How people would relate to this in the context of post-pandemic. There will be a tendency all the time to be closer to home because you will feel safer. It's cleaner somehow. The perception is like that. So the home range, home zone perspectives will change. When we look at place attachment aspects, most of place attachment research place emphasis on some of these parameters: heritage, family, aesthetics, proximity, recreation, all aspects. But it doesn't explicitly say health and perception of health. So, and I think health in the future for individuals and the perception of it, the perception of cleanliness, what constitutes clean, would impact people's attachment to places, would impact perceptions of personal safety, public health, and how this also impact play areas and children areas, whether in the heart of the city or in residential neighborhoods. When we look at the social distancing measures and what we learned in the past from Edward Hall and Henry Sanoff and all those theorists and scholars, now when we say distancing measures are mandating that we have to observe the 2 meters distance, this is altering our perception of what happened over the past 50 years from the understanding of relationships, intimate, personal, social, and public. Likely, most of us will function in the social and public, especially again, if this remains in our memory. So this is an invitation to revisit the Edward Hall proximity relationships and proxemics and the notion of proxemics. About a year and a half ago, with a group of colleagues, we studied 9 urban spaces in Glasgow, trying to look at a number of parameters. And we were emphasizing social distancing and all that before this pandemic came in. Definitely, I would say many of the results of this paper, if you conduct it now, will be totally different. Whatever is said in the paper in 2017 is obsolete now if you do the same thing and the same exercise in the current conditions, because the contextual circumstances have changed. Which lead us to think about urban life and urban form dialectics, and how urban form and urban life can be looked at from very, very positive perspective, and also from very negative perspective. One interesting element, for example, we keep talking about active engagement and passive engagement as part of the important qualities of urban spaces. And I think there will be, in the future, there will be a preference toward passive engagement. You will go to a public space, you don't want to interact with anyone, but you will watch everyone. But you will minimize the level of interaction. Of course, this will be relative, and it depends on the condition of the pandemic and the impact of it from one city to another. But it looks like now, many people are talking about it as an annual event. And this is really very scary. So if it happens to be an annual event, what's going to happen? So all the social norms and social theories even will change seasonally. So we will have a specific understanding in the winter and how we behave in the winter, and another understanding in the summer and how we behave in the summer. And these are important dimensions. Probably we need to think of as we try to understand the relationship between the social and the spatial. If we look at these slides, or images, the ones to the right are basically a representation of the lockdown condition. You can still see people, but no interaction. Somebody walking here and there, but the ones to the left, which is nearby where I live, you can see lots of activities and lots of things and active engagement with the environment and with people. Now, this is our main, in Glasgow, this is our main public space that characterized the city really, or the city center, I would say. Now, George Square, from public festivals to activities to oral speaking to sometimes concerts to everything take place seasonally in this space, and now not much is happening or nothing is happening basically. Still you can see people walking. So that condition of the COVID-19 will definitely alter our understanding of the social spatial, or how the social impacts the spatial. So I will end here, but you can read this statement on your own, but I have to say that we should have predicted the condition we are in now. Many theorists were talking about where we are now 20 years ago and even 30 years ago. William Mitchell, who was the dean of MIT, was talking about the city of bits, electronic utopia, me++, and his theology of trying to understand even sustainable urbanism from a virtual perspective. When we say, or we see Emmanuel Castell talking about how the global city is not necessarily a physical place. He said that in 1992, okay? And now we are saying the same thing or witnessing the same thing. How the global city is not necessarily a physical place, but a process. So if you look at the process dimension now, this discussion and this webinar is part of that process. And it's happening in a virtual space. There's no physical space. Physical space where everybody is, but there is no physical space that integrates us. We are meeting on a virtual space. So I'll finish here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will place myself. Thank you so much, Professor Salama. I think it was a brilliant lecture. It has taken us from even the past to the future and now, and it is very certain that we are experiencing a very interesting months, let's say, months and days. And the one of the important thing is that we cannot actually foresee the future, and not exactly. We can make some assumptions based on where we are, what we are doing, what is happening all around. But of course, as you have been mentioning, the cultural and social aspects of everything is going to affect the future one way or the other. On behalf of our center, I would like to thank you. We have a couple of questions. We have 2 questions so far. I don't know if you are able to see the questions, or should I be reading them for you?
I can see the 2 questions.
Okay.
Okay, the first question is about does the cultural social behavior relation complete the link, complete to link behavior to culture again as a cycle? Okay, of course, at a conceptual level, yes, all these elements are working together. And if we say the environment influences behavior and influences culture, and in turn culture influences the environment, no doubt. And there have been lots of discussions about this, but this is also relative. It varies across contexts and across settlements and settings and all that. And it all depends on the nature of people and the circumstances. So I would say yes, but depends on the contextual aspects. The second question is about, is the ownership of public space going
to change? I think it will be change.
Because we are, okay, shipping orders daily. Okay. That's a very important point, I must say, about the ownership of public space. Mm-hmm. We always talk about the ownership of public space and how the ownership and people taking ownership of the public space would improve it. And it's not perceived as the authority or representation of the authority or power over the masses. We talk about these issues in political terms. But I would say the current circumstances is influencing how people believe in the government system. Because now you get your advice from the government, or you get all of the advice from the government. Stay home or you will die. So that advice basically might have implication on the use of public space, and it becomes again another ownership of the governments and the local authority, not the ownership by people. So it's subject to different interpretations, but I would say ownership will be a critical factor in the how do you define digital space will be necessary to address in the future and phenomenology of space formation. No doubt. Of course, understanding the virtual space and the digital space will be an important dimension, and even the social spatial within the virtual space. So how do we behave in a virtual environment? Still now we are it's like primitive societies when they didn't know how to deal with each other in the past. So now we are trying to experiment and we are trying to look for protocols on how we communicate online, who talks first, who should wait, who engage with others, and all these aspects. Given that we don't have too many tools to engage at a large scale. And remember, there is a very important point. Now people are engaging based on the knowledge of one another before the event. So now, in the future, how you're going to engage with others that you never met in reality, and you will continue to engage with them in a virtual environment. So I think this will have lots of implications. So move on. How do you think all these will affect contested spaces in conflicting areas? Of course, this is a very important question and difficult to answer, because now, if you notice that this condition that we are in now, it stopped civic conflict in certain areas. If you look, for example, in Santiago, Chile, there was a lot of civil unrest immediately before the pandemic between different groups and political parties. Now focused on these aspects. So I would say it will have an impact. I don't know. Am I too close or is it too loud? Maybe.
No, it's my microphone. I'll mute my microphone. Sorry.
Okay. So I think one of the important dimensions is, to start to try to think of how we're going to get, and that's an important dimension, how we're going to get empirical information to validate all these conjectures and speculations. So at the moment we are speculating. So I'm responding to some of the questions based on my conjectures, based on my guesses, but I don't have concrete facts yet. So you try to read certain experiences from the history. You try to employ your own thinking and understanding of some theories, and then project that to the future. But we need to start to get empirical information. Is COVID-19 affect to shrink the high density city if majority are thinking or shrinking? How will be the public open space? Okay, so we're talking about the survival of public spaces, basically, and how public spaces will change. If you look at few slides in the presentation, in terms of people activities within these spaces, there's no doubt that there will be a change. And as I say, the longer we are in this transition period, the memory will continue with us, will stay with us. If it becomes part of the collective psyche, if pandemics become annual events, then there is no doubt that our understanding of public space and how we treat it, and even how we conceive it, how local authorities and governments make decisions about public spaces, that's an important dimension, will be different in the future. Thank you for the information. What are your thoughts? Resiliency of our systems, architecture education system, the practice of architecture. Excellent question, I have to say. It's, of course, I can talk about this one for a bit long, but I'll try to just cover two areas. Resilience definitely will be looked at from a different perspective, even sustainability and sustainable cities and all that. Now, you feel that people are pausing a little bit, thinking about other aspects and looking at how COVID-19 will impact existing interests or current interests. So there's no doubt that there will be change. Resilience now, societies and cities are subjected to a resilience test at the moment. So how we are coping and how cities are coping and how economy is coping and how networks between people are coping, all these aspects are part of resilience. But in terms of architecture education and practice, I want to emphasize that health was never part of architecture education last 20 years. Yes, we talk about it, 2 minutes here and there. But I think health will become a very important aspect and a design determinant when we talk about designing for architecture or urbanism. Health, collaboration with other disciplines, I think will control eventually the scene of architecture education. If you want to engage with other areas that architects don't have expertise with, then probably you would have transdisciplinary projects, you would have transdisciplinary curricula at the master level, where you deliver a master degree, for example, that engages psychologists, architects, health science, and all that. There is an expectation for that. Some universities now are designing programs, master programs for crisis architecture, crisis urbanism. So how do we discuss urbanism at a time of crisis? And these crises don't have to be pandemics only, so can be health, pandemics, wars, disasters, and all these. So how to conceive the city in changing circumstances of these crises and phenomena. So I think there will be an impact on architecture education, impact on architecture practice. Even in the UK, health is not part of mainstream practice. It's addressed, it's talked about in the context of regulations and ventilation requirements and all these aspects. But health as an explicit component of design requirements will take some time. Remember one important thing. When people started to talk about disability and designing for disability, we talked about it about 25 years before it became part of the law. And in America, it took legislation. It had to be part of the law for architects to respond seriously to it. Okay, so that's also another important aspect. And still, there are issues with disabilities in many European cities as part of addressing them in the design exercise. So I think it will take some time, but health is a critical component and a critical dimension. To regulate the social and special people behavior will continue after the pandemic. This will somehow form the new way of establishing the social. There is no doubt these current measures will have impact on the social in a way or another. And as I say, what we understood from anthropology, sociology, environmental psychology, and designers, all the work of the environmental psychology group and environment behavior studies is now subject to revision, basically. It was valid for 50 years. Now, with the current measures, what's going to happen with it? There will be an impact. It's a good question also. about whether the social is emerging. So your question is trying to look at the social in terms of it is created. It's not happening spontaneously. It is manufactured. And I would say, in terms of rules and regulations, yes. And what is acceptable. Now, if you get close to a person on the street, is not acceptable, and it's part of the social norm now in the city. So in terms of rules and regulations, the creation of it, yes. But in terms of our reaction to it, still it will remain spontaneous. Many people are not believing in what governments are saying and behaving normally. So that kind of spontaneity and informality will, I guess, continue with the new rules and new regulations and new distancing measures. Well, examining the transformation of conceived and perceived space of a city gives some information related to preventing pandemic process. It all depends. Yes, of course, we can also look at cities from Greece to London to what happened in New York sometime 100 years ago, and many European cities in 1920, or yeah, 1920, and how they were coping with disease spread. Of course, we can learn from Southeast Asian cities also in terms of density and how they worked with it. But it's very important, if we're going to look at these as case studies, we need to look at them from that perspective of conceived, perceived, lived. So who made decisions, how decisions were made to control that, how they manifest in terms of economy and companies and big players in society and the development of network during a pandemic period, and then how it translated into the lived space and actions and behaviors. A colleague of mine is doing a very important conference actually yesterday, and part of it is today, and it's called Pandemic Urbanism, but from a historical perspective at Morgan State University with a couple of other people. So looking at how cities have addressed pandemics and virus spread over periods of time and over historical periods. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to look at it, but it is really important. This morning we had a communication, and probably there will be something, or at least dissemination for the ideas generated there will be available. Density will be affected by COVID-19, but remain the difference between Southeast Asia and Europe. Okay. It's a very important point, but we want to also realize that successful European cities are characterized by high density and compactness. So, of course, not comparable to Southeast East Asian cities like if we talk about Seoul, for example, or if we talk about Hong Kong or even Singapore, although it's not as dense as Hong Kong. But successful European cities, if you look at certain parts of London, certain parts of Glasgow, Edinburgh, certain parts of Manchester, it brings lots of benefits to cities. And of course, it will remain a difference in terms of relativity. Yes, it's denser in Southeast Asia than in Europe, but still, it's an important dimension in successful urban environments and city centers. Following resiliency question: what's your projection on how tourist cities, heavily populated urban spaces, will transform post-pandemic? That's a difficult one. It requires a lot of research, I must say. But I would expect that we're going to see different forms of tourism and different forms of engagement. Now, people were circulating a joke that a woman is hugging her mother virtually, and how this happens. And when they met physically, each one of them was wearing a transparent robe, and they were doing that. So I really cannot say much about this, but all I can say, if this continues, it will be a problem for tourism and tourism economy and all that. And I think there will be very, very difficult restrictions, because I feel that tourism will become luxury. Traveling will become luxury, because now if you employ social distancing measures in flights, it means that you will fly with less number of people. You will have to pay a lot of money for the ticket and all that. Even in hotels, even in beaches and all that, there will be limitations on the use and social distancing measures if they continue. So definitely the shape of the tourist city will be altered in a way or another, whether in terms of the flood of tourism or in terms of actual tourism behavior and associated activities with tourism. It's a good point about cultures and communities and countries, the idea of country versus community. I would say globalization, pre-pandemic, globalization have generated that condition of a city is more important than a country. Okay, when you look at Dubai, for example, Dubai name and Doha name are very well known to other people. When you mention UAE, not many people understand it. Okay, but when you say Dubai, everybody knows Dubai. When you say Singapore, everybody knows Singapore as a city. Seoul. And if you look also at the relationship and the networks between cities, so a city like Seoul in South Korea has to do with Singapore and Hong Kong than with other smaller towns and villages in Korea, in the country itself. So I think the idea of city became favored or became the standard practice over a country, and lower interest in nationalism and all that. The idea of community might evolve based on the amount of network formations that will take place online. So because also eventually you will find different types of networks and different types of organizations, and it will be also involving exclusivity in terms of this group is dealing with that, okay, they don't want other people to be part of them, another group is doing other things. So, and it will follow that tribalist thinking eventually. We are still in the, do you think it's early to do? Okay. Of course, it's not early, I would say, but it is speculations, no doubt. We don't have empirical information and empirical facts, but I cannot say, okay, let's stand still and watch and don't do anything. And I would say what is really good these days, the amount of architectural discourse that was generated last 2 months show that the intellectual scene within architecture as a discipline online is really very vibrant and very active and very healthy, regardless of the type of perception and how people see it. But at the end, the level of discussion is intensive, and I think it's important, and I don't think it's early, because certain reports are saying, okay, there are talks about annual events. So what you're going to do if there is a lockdown period all over the world, in all cities around the world, from November to January, what we're gonna do about this? Okay, and this could continue for years. So definitely, I would say it's not early, but it is a speculation and requires validation and more empirical work and more empirical research. Although density is not a big problem in terms of health issues due to the pandemic, do you think that people will move to the peripheries? It's a very, very good question also, because actually I was writing a very short article, 800 words, required by something called conversation. Conversation is a platform where people from different parts of the world and universities publish research findings. And that question is being answered now. Actually, I'm writing it now. But I would tell you, those who can afford might end up with seasonal migration. So the weekend house idea will be important. During pandemic times, you will go outside of the city if you can afford it, and in safe periods, you will come back to the city. That's a possibility. If people are approaching retirement, yes, they might end up choosing not to live in the city and go to peripheries or even to rural areas. So these are possibilities and important questions, I would say. Thank you very much, Hasina. Sorry, the text is a bit small, and sometimes it's difficult to read it. I believe this comment. Okay. Very good. Okay.
No, I thought you are becoming tired. It has been like an hour and a half in plus 15 minutes initial talks. So it has been, I think, a wonderful discussion. I think you have like opened up a lot of questions in our minds, in the attendees' minds. We had more than 35 attendees altogether. Not too bad. It's okay. Maybe for a Friday afternoon or late afternoon here, this is okay. So I would like to thank you very much for this brilliant lecture, I should say, and thank you on behalf of our center, our university, that you have accepted our invitation. And I would like to thank all the attendees, all the participants who have contributed with their questions and so on. And we hope to see everybody, including you, somewhere really alive.
Yes.
In a real place, but not only virtual place. Yeah. But until then, we have to say goodbye.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.